Michael Madsen, 67 years old, died in 2025. Val Kilmer, 65 years old, died in 2025. Robert Redford, 89 years old, died in 2025. Jerry Adler, 96 years old, died in 2025. Paula Shaw, 84 years old, died in 2025. Peter Jason, 80 years old, died in 2025. June Lockhart, 100 years old, died in 2025. Devin Hargess, 41 years old, died in 2025. Loretta Swit, 87 years old, died in 2025. Sally Kirkland, 84 years old, died in 2025. Diane Keaton, 79 years old, died in 2025. Diane Ladd, 89 years old, died in 2025. Rick Hurst, 79 years old, died in 2025. Aki Aleong, 90 years old, died in 2025. Joe Marinell, 68 years old, died in 2025. Jack Betts, 96 years old, died in 2025. Lynn Hamilton, 95 years old, died in 2025. Gaylord Sartain, 78 years old, died in 2025. Betsy Gay, 96 years old, died in 2025. David Hakili Kenui Bell, 46 years old, died in 2025. Harris Yu Lin, 87 years old, died in 2025. Chris Robinson, 86 years old, died in 2025. Jonathan Joss, 59 years old, died in 2025. Charlie Scalise, 84 years old, died in 2025. Joan O'Brien, 89 years old, died in 2025. Joe Don Baker, 89 years old, died in 2025. Tina Elg, 95 years old, died in 2025. Steve Inwood, 78 years old, died in 2025. Kathleen Hughes, 96 years old, died in 2025. George Wendt, 76 years old, died in 2025. Pippa Scott, 90 years old, died in 2025. Peter Kwong, 73 years old, died in 2025. Valerie Mahaffey, 71 years old, died in 2025. Renee Victor, 86 years old, died in 2025. Suzanne Rand, 75 years old, died in 2025. Stephen Mohanan, 78 years old, died in 2025. Jay North, 73 years old, died in 2025. Joey De Vieira, 80 years old, died in 2025. Nikki Cat, 54 years old, died in 2025. Mel Novak, 90 years old, died in 2025. Mario Ernesto Sanchez, 78 years old, died in 2025. Sophie Nuvida, 24 years old, died in 2025. Patrick Adiarte, 81 years old, died in 2025. Joanne Gilbert, 92 years old, died in 2025. Ina Hartman, 90 years old, died in 2025. Lar Park Lincoln, 63 years old, died in 2025. Cora Sue Collins, 98 years old, died in 2025. Priscilla Pointer, 100 years old, died in 2025. Craig T. Nelson, 81 years old, died in 2025. Denise Alexander, 85 years old, died in 2025. Pamela Bach Hasselhoff, 61 years old, died in 2025. Mark Dobies, 65 years old, died in 2025. Robert Trebor, 71 years old, died in 2025. Bruce Glovar, 92 years old, died in 2025. Sam Macaroni, 49 years old, died in 2025. Wings Hauser, 77 years old, died in 2025. Dennis Arndt, 86 years old, died in 2025. Richard Chamberlain, 90 years old, died in 2025. Patty Maloney, 89 years old, died in 2025. Sian Barbar Allen, 78 years old, died in 2025.